Hi everybody, my presentation today will discuss the issue of student debt and employment. I will first begin by giving a brief introduction into student debt and the impacts of employment upon graduation. Next, I will discuss implemented student debt policies. Afterwards, I will provide an analysis of these student debt policies, and later I will provide some future recommendations on student debt and employment. As the early 1990s, student debt has become an ongoing issue which has increased the financial burden on university students. Upon graduation, majority of young adults find themselves working in their unrelated fields of study only to relieve the strain of student debt. Government initiatives have been taken to call upon this issue of student debt. These initiatives include the implementation of programs such as grants, loan forgiveness programs, and decreased loan repayment methods. Though these initiatives work to some extent, students still face difficulty in loan repayments. The main question here is, in what other ways can employers and institutions become more involved in the employment opportunities of young graduates? One way is the idea of increasing employer engagement. For example, employers can create student debt programs hiring recent graduates who have the knowledge and skills. In return, employers can pay a specific percentage towards the graduate student loans based on the performance level of the graduate. This method can be used instead of a bonus towards the end of a year. So now let us look at some implemented student debt policies. In 1994, the Canadian Student Financial Assistance Act was passed to increase borrowing limits for both full-time and part-time students, created different loan repayment options, offered grant opportunities, and also changed assessment mechanisms and created new mechanisms for financing student loans through the private sector. Policies such as the CSFA have been applied due to the increase of privatization of post-secondary institutions. The growing number of privately owned educational institutions have forced many students to find ways to financially support their own education. From the decade of 1990 to 2000, undergraduate tuition rates rose by over 135%, more than 6 times the rate of inflation. Ontario was one of the provinces which had the highest increase in tuition rates. As a result of these privatization policies, students participated in more loan borrowing, which increased the difficulty of loan repayment. So why exactly are these policies important, and how do they tackle this issue of student debt and employment? In 1997, the government implemented the Canadian Opportunity Strategies program to assist those struggling with student debt. This program proposed budgets to cover areas such as research assistance for graduate students, assistance in loan repayments for families, providing students with necessary skills for the workforce, and encouraging employment services to hire young graduates and students. In addition to the COS program, the federal government created the biggest investment program by implementing the Canadian Millennium Scholarships to provide both full-time and part-time students with financial assistance. The implementation of these programs began in 2000 and were rewarded to those who needed help financing their studies and demonstrate merit. But what exactly does this mean? Who would be eligible for the scholarship? How is this calculated? And would it be calculated based on the students' income levels who are financially struggling? It sounds a little vague. The Canadian government has introduced several different loan repayment programs and offered grant opportunities and scholarships for students. However, these loan repayment options do not tackle the exact issue of student debt, as high levels of debt impact employment. A 1997 National Graduate Survey indicated that students who owe high levels of debt at $30,000 or more, and those with income levels below $30,000, had significant difficulty in loan repayments. Loan repayments and stability of employment are significantly related, as those who graduated and are employed for less than 6 months in June 1997 had difficulty compared to those who had their job for 2 or 3 years. Graduates with few assets are entering employment positions of precarious work in which they are overqualified for to receive immediate income. This only creates a vicious cycle and a life-impacting strain of student debt. The issue itself is, students are graduating with significantly high levels of student debt. How can this debt be reduced in terms of employer engagement? Instead, these scholarships can be handed to employers through the government-funded programs, and eligible students can not only gain these scholarships, but also work with employers. This will create a level of partnerships between educational institutions, the government, and employers. This will allow students to work with employers and create a stable form of employment upon graduation, but also reduce the life-impacting strain of student debt. Loan repayment options do not reduce student debt, but rather allows more time and flexibility in repaying loans, and also creates increased levels of financial burden amongst recent graduates who are in need of an immediate income. So the question remains, in what other ways can levels of student debt be reduced in terms of employer engagement? Let us take a look at some programs which were used to tackle the issue of student debt. Through conducted research, service-linked programs were offered to eligible students in exchange for financial incentives. But what exactly does this mean? Students, mainly medical-related, were given opportunities to work with employers in rural areas in exchange for financial incentives. Reason being, there was a shortage of nurses and physicians in areas such as southeastern parts of the United States. These cohort studies were used to gather eligible nursing students in rural areas, and in exchange, they would receive financial incentives. This included paying for most or all of the students' tuition, granting scholarship opportunities, and even paying for personal expenses. Though there were issues collecting data on the success rates of these studies, it still created a form of engagement between loan programs, employers, as well as educational institutions. These studies also recruited recent graduates, which allowed these new graduates to be positioned with employers, using skills and knowledge learned from their degree in exchange for financial incentives. Within these studies, researchers suggested that policymakers work closely with educational institutions to increase success rates of programs using similar methods of financial incentives for rural work. Majority of these programs focus on recruiting medical students. However, there is also a need to recruit students of different faculties in rural areas, as they could also benefit from financial incentives. Conducting research based on recruiting recent graduates of different faculties could help decrease student loans, but also create a form of engagement and partnerships.